The moment I realized I was not supposed to be in the family photo was the moment I understood that some exclusions are planned long before they happen. Christmas morning had always been my favorite day of the year. I woke up before sunrise that morning, just as I always did, and quietly slipped out of bed so I would not wake Daniel. Outside the bedroom window, a light layer of snow covered the backyard, turning everything white and peaceful. The house smelled like cinnamon rolls and fresh coffee. For a few minutes, standing alone in the kitchen wearing thick socks and an oversized holiday sweater, I allowed myself to believe it was going to be a perfect day. Daniel's family gathered every Christmas at his father Walter's house just outside Burlington, Vermont. We had been married for 5 years, and every year I worked hard to make the holiday special. I wrapped gifts. I baked desserts. I remembered birthdays and anniversaries. I bought thoughtful presents for relatives who rarely remembered mine. I told myself that family took time, that eventually I would feel like I belonged. By 9 o'clock, the house was full of laughter. Children raced between rooms carrying new toys. Christmas music played softly from a speaker near the fireplace. Relatives stood around the kitchen island drinking coffee and sharing stories. Walter greeted everyone with his usual warmth. He hugged me when I arrived and thanked me for bringing the pecan pie he loved every year. That simple gesture meant more than he probably realized. Around 11 o'clock, someone suggested taking a family photo in front of the enormous Christmas tree. Everyone immediately agreed. People gathered gifts out of the way. Chairs were moved. Grandchildren were called into the room. The entire family slowly assembled in front of the tree while sunlight streamed through the large windows. I was helping one of Daniel's nieces fix a ribbon in her hair when I noticed everyone finding a place in the photo. Daniel stood near the center. His sisters stood beside him. Their spouses joined them. Even distant cousins were being called over. I smiled and started walking toward the group. Then I noticed something strange. Nobody looked at me. Nobody waved me over. Nobody said my name. The space around the tree became more crowded. People adjusted positions. Someone laughed. Someone else moved closer. There was still room for me. Plenty of room. Yet somehow that space felt closed. I slowed my steps. Daniel glanced in my direction for less than a second before looking away. That was when a cold feeling settled into my stomach. Not because there was no room. Because there was. Not because they forgot me. Because they had not. I was standing less than 10 feet away. Then Daniel picked up a phone and handed it toward me. "Claire, can you take the picture?" he asked casually. The room suddenly felt very quiet. I looked at the phone in my hands. Then at the smiling faces gathered beneath the tree. Then back at Daniel. Nobody said anything. Nobody objected. And as I raised the phone and looked through the camera screen, I realized there was one thing missing from the perfect family photo. Me. I took the picture. I even smiled while doing it. Years of practice had taught me how to hide disappointment behind good manners. "Everybody look here," I said. The children laughed. The adults leaned closer together. Daniel wrapped an arm around his sister's shoulder. Someone made a joke. The camera clicked 3 times. Then it was over. Just like that. A memory had been created, and I was not part of it. I handed the phone back to Daniel. "Thanks," he said without really looking at me. I nodded and stepped aside. Nobody seemed uncomfortable. Nobody acted as though anything unusual had happened. That was what hurt the most. Not the exclusion itself. The normality of it. As if everyone had silently agreed that my place was behind the camera instead of in the frame. The rest of the family drifted toward the dining room where brunch was being prepared. The smell of maple-glazed ham and cinnamon filled the house. Christmas music continued playing softly from somewhere near the kitchen. I carried a tray of mugs from the counter to the table because it gave me something to do with my hands. "Everything okay?" Daniel asked as he passed by. "Of course," I replied. He nodded and kept walking. 5 years earlier, that answer would have bothered him. He would have stopped, asked questions, looked me in the eye. Somewhere along the way, things had changed. I stood near the sink for a moment pretending to organize dishes. Across the room, family members were already looking at the photo. They laughed and pointed at different faces. One of Daniel's cousins suggested printing it for next year's Christmas card. Nobody mentioned that I was missing. A few minutes later, I walked upstairs to place my coat in the guest bedroom. I needed a moment alone. The hallway was quiet. For the first time all morning, I could hear my own thoughts. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was not intentional. Maybe I was tired. I repeated those excuses in my mind, even though I no longer believed them. As I entered the bedroom, I noticed Daniel's phone lying on the dresser. He must have left it there while changing earlier. The screen lit up with a new message. I was not trying to snoop. In fact, I almost looked away. Then I saw the preview. The message came from a family group chat. Only a few words were visible. They were enough. Glad we kept it family only. I froze. My heart seemed to stop for a second. The screen dimmed before I could see who sent it. I stared at my reflection in the dark glass. Suddenly, the empty space beside the Christmas tree made perfect sense. It had not been awkward. It had not been accidental. It had been discussed, planned, agreed upon. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. Downstairs, I could hear laughter echoing through the house. Someone turned the music louder. Someone opened another gift. Christmas continued as though nothing was wrong. But for me, everything had changed. Because for the first time, I was no longer wondering whether I belonged. I was beginning to realize that someone had decided I did not. For a long time, I sat there staring at the dark phone screen. The message itself was short, only a few words. Yet those few words explained years of uncertainty better than any conversation ever had. Downstairs, the sounds of Christmas continued. Dishes clinked. Children laughed. Someone started singing along to an old holiday song. Life moved forward as though nothing important had happened. I took a slow breath and placed the phone exactly where I had found it. Then I stood and walked back downstairs. Nobody noticed anything different about me. Daniel was helping his nephew open a toy train set. His sisters were arranging food on the dining table. The family photo was already being passed from phone to phone. Everyone admired it. Everyone except me. I poured myself a cup of coffee and joined the others. If someone had looked closely, they might have noticed I was quieter than usual. But nobody looked closely. That was part of the problem. Over the years, I had become useful, reliable, dependable. The person who remembered details. The person who volunteered. The person who made things easier. Somehow, I had become so useful that people stopped seeing me. Around noon, everyone gathered in the dining room for Christmas brunch. Walter sat at the head of the long table. As always, he made sure every seat was filled before touching his food. I took my usual place near the end. Daniel sat beside me, but barely spoke. The conversation flowed around sports, holiday travel, and family memories. I listened more than I talked. Every now and then, someone laughed loudly. Every now and then, I glanced toward the framed family photos displayed along the nearby shelves. Decades of Christmas gatherings stared back at me. Generations preserved in pictures. Then something caught my attention. Daniel's younger sister, Megan, was showing the new photo to relatives across the table. They smiled and complimented it. One person suggested posting it online. Another talked about making copies. Nobody mentioned the missing person. Suddenly, Walter put down his fork. The movement was small, but everyone noticed. Walter was not a loud man. He never needed to be. When he spoke, people listened. He looked around the table slowly before focusing on the phone displaying the picture. "That turned out nice," he said. Several people nodded. "Beautiful photo," someone agreed. Walter continued studying the image. His expression did not change. "Interesting." The room grew slightly quieter. Daniel looked up. "What is interesting?" Walter lifted his eyes from the screen. "I was just wondering why Claire is not in it." The words landed softly, yet somehow they seemed louder than anything said all morning. Nobody answered immediately. Daniel shifted in his chair. Megan lowered her phone. A few relatives suddenly became very interested in their coffee cups. Walter waited. Calm, patient, observant. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Then Walter asked the question a second time. "Why is the strongest member of this family missing from the family picture?" Nobody moved. Nobody laughed. Nobody rushed to answer Walter's question. The only sound in the room came from the Christmas music playing faintly in the next room. I kept my eyes on my plate. Part of me wanted the moment to end. Another part wanted someone to finally say what had been obvious all morning. Walter looked around the table again. His expression remained calm, but there was something firm behind it. "I am serious," he said. "Why is Claire not in the picture?" Daniel cleared his throat. "Dad, it is not a big deal." Walter raised an eyebrow. "Then it should be easy to explain." Daniel shifted in his chair. "Someone had to take the photo." "We own tripods," Walter replied. A few people looked down immediately. Someone near the far end of the table hid a smile behind a coffee mug. Daniel glanced around the room as if searching for support. None came. "You are making this awkward," he said. Walter nodded slowly. "No, What is awkward is excluding your wife from a family photograph on Christmas morning. The silence returned. This time it felt heavier. I could feel eyes moving between Daniel and Walter. Nobody seemed comfortable anymore. For years, small moments had been ignored. Little slights, quiet exclusions, things that were easy to dismiss one at a time. But suddenly they were all sitting in the middle of the table where everyone could see them. Walter leaned back slightly. Do you know who bought half the gifts under that tree? Nobody answered. Claire. He pointed toward the kitchen. Do you know who spent 2 days baking desserts for this gathering? Again, nobody answered. Claire. His voice never became louder. It did not need to. Do you know who remembers birthdays, sends cards, helps organize reunions, and somehow manages to make every holiday easier for the rest of us? I felt my face grow warm. Walter looked directly at Daniel. Your wife. Daniel stared at the table. For the first time all day, he seemed unable to find the right words. His sister Megan shifted uncomfortably. Maybe we should just take another picture, she said quietly. Walter nodded. That would be a good start. Then he turned toward me. Claire, did anyone ask whether being left out bothered you? I hesitated. Every person at the table was looking at me now. Not really, I admitted. Walter was silent for a moment. I thought so. Something changed in the room after that. It was subtle, but I felt it immediately. People stopped avoiding eye contact. They stopped pretending nothing unusual had happened. The photograph no longer looked harmless. It looked incomplete. Then Walter reached for the phone, displaying the image. He studied it carefully before setting it back down. Interesting, he said softly. There is another thing I noticed. Daniel looked up. What? Walter met his eyes. This picture looks exactly like the family photo someone planned to take. The words settled over the table. And suddenly, I remembered the message I had seen upstairs. Glad we kept it family only. For the first time that day, I began to wonder whether Walter had noticed more than anyone realized. The conversation moved on after that, at least on the surface. Plates were cleared. Coffee was refilled. Someone turned the music up a little louder, as if holiday songs could smooth over the tension that had settled across the dining room. But nothing felt normal anymore. Walter's question lingered in the air long after nobody was speaking about it. I noticed small changes in people. Daniel's sisters were quieter. His cousins seemed unusually careful with their words. Even the children appeared to sense that something important had happened. Walter, however, acted completely calm. He helped carry dishes into the kitchen. He complimented the food. He listened to conversations. To anyone watching. From outside, he looked like a man enjoying Christmas with his family. But every now and then, I caught him observing people. Not judging them. Watching them. Paying attention. Around 1 o'clock, gifts began disappearing from beneath the tree. Wrapping paper filled trash bags. Relatives wandered between rooms talking and laughing. I stepped onto the enclosed back porch for a few minutes to clear my head. Snow covered the yard beyond the windows. The world outside looked peaceful. Inside, my thoughts were anything but peaceful. I kept replaying the message I had seen on Daniel's phone. Glad we kept it family only. The words refused to leave me alone. A few minutes later, the porch door opened behind me. Walter stepped outside carrying 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to me. Thought you might need this. Thank you. We stood quietly for a moment watching snowflakes drift across the yard. Finally, Walter spoke. You have been trying very hard for a long time. I looked down at my cup. I do not know what you mean. He smiled slightly. Yes, you do. There was no accusation in his voice. Only understanding. You noticed? I asked. Walter looked out the window. I noticed more than people think. Neither of us mentioned the photograph directly. We did not need to. He already understood. I am sorry, he said quietly. For what? For allowing small things to go unchallenged for too long. His honesty surprised me. Before I could respond, voices drifted in from the living room. Someone was calling for Walter. He set down his cup and started toward the door. Then he stopped. There is something else you should know. I looked at him. What? Walter hesitated. That photograph was not the first time the subject came up today. My stomach tightened. What do you mean? He sighed. Earlier this morning, before everyone arrived, I overheard part of a conversation. For the first time all day, genuine disappointment appeared on his face. And what I heard explained a great deal. Before I could ask another question, the door opened and Daniel appeared. Dad, everyone is looking for you. Walter nodded, but kept his eyes on me for one brief moment. It was enough. I knew he had heard something important, something connected to the message. Something connected to the photograph. And judging by the expression on his face, whatever he knew was about to change the rest of Christmas. The rest of the afternoon passed beneath a strange cloud of anticipation. Nobody else seemed aware of it, but I felt it every time Walter looked across the room. He knew something. More importantly, he had decided he was no longer willing to keep it to himself. Around 2 o'clock, everyone gathered in the living room for dessert and coffee. Snow continued falling outside the large windows. The Christmas tree glowed softly in the corner, surrounded by open gifts and crumpled wrapping paper. From a distance, it still looked like a perfect family holiday. Up close, cracks were beginning to show. Walter settled into his favorite chair near the fireplace. The conversation drifted from holiday travel plans to old family memories. I noticed Daniel growing increasingly uncomfortable whenever Walter entered the discussion. He seemed distracted, restless. Every few minutes, he checked his phone. Finally, Walter set down his coffee cup. "You know," he said casually, "this morning reminded me of something that happened a long time ago." Several relatives looked toward him. Walter rarely told stories without a reason. "About 40 years ago," he continued, "I spent Christmas with your mother's family." He looked directly at Daniel. "Back then, I was the outsider." Nobody interrupted. I remember standing in a room full of people who were technically family, but did not quite treat me like it. Nobody was rude. Nobody yelled. Nobody said anything cruel. They simply made sure I understood where I stood. His voice remained calm. "People think exclusion has to be loud to hurt. It does not." The room grew noticeably quieter. Daniel stared at the floor. Walter continued. "What stayed with me all these years was not what happened. It was watching everyone pretend it had not happened." Several family members shifted uncomfortably. Megan lowered her eyes. One cousin suddenly became fascinated by a napkin in his hands. Then Walter did something unexpected. He pulled out his phone. "Earlier this morning, before guests arrived, I walked into the kitchen looking for coffee." Daniel immediately looked up. "Dad," Walter ignored him. "I was not trying to listen, but I heard part of a conversation." Nobody moved. "I heard someone say they wanted a family photo without Claire in it." My heart started beating faster. Across the room, Daniel's face lost color. Walter's voice remained steady. Then I heard someone agree. The silence that followed felt endless. Finally, Walter looked directly at his son. "Would you like to tell everyone why?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. For several seconds, he simply sat there. Then he sighed heavily and rubbed his forehead. The confident explanations he usually relied on were nowhere to be found. "It was not supposed to be a big deal," he said quietly. Walter nodded once. "That is often what people say when they know it was." Nobody laughed. Nobody defended him. And for the first time all day, Daniel seemed to realize he was not being judged for a photograph. He was being judged for what that photograph revealed. Daniel stared at the floor for several long seconds after speaking. Nobody rushed to rescue him. Nobody changed the subject. The room had reached that rare moment when everyone understood that the truth was finally standing in the open. Walter folded his hands and waited. He did not look angry. He looked disappointed. Somehow that seemed harder for Daniel to face. "It was just supposed to be for immediate family," Daniel said at last. The explanation sounded weak even to him. Walter tilted his head slightly. "Your wife is your immediate family." Nobody argued with that. Not a single person in the room. Daniel swallowed hard. "That is not what I meant." "Then tell us what you meant," Walter replied calmly. The silence stretched again. I watched my husband search for words. For years, he had been able to explain away uncomfortable situations. But this time there was nowhere to hide. Too many people had seen what happened. Too many people understood what it meant. Finally, Daniel looked toward me. "Claire, I never wanted to hurt you." I believed he meant that. The problem was that intention and action were not the same thing. "Then why did you do it?" I asked quietly. My voice surprised even me. It was calm, steady, almost detached. Daniel looked away. "Because it seemed easier." The words landed heavily. Walter closed his eyes briefly. Across the room, Megan covered her M. The atmosphere in the room felt completely different after that. Nobody was pretending anymore. The polite holiday smiles had faded, replaced by honest reflection. For the first time in years, people seemed willing to look directly at something they had spent a long time avoiding. Daniel sat quietly, staring at the floor. He no longer appeared defensive. He looked exhausted. Across the room, Walter remained calm. He had not raised his voice once all day. He had not embarrassed anyone. He had simply forced the truth into the open where it could no longer be ignored. A few minutes later, Megan stood up from her chair. "I want to show everyone something," she said softly. She picked up her phone and pulled up the family photograph. The same photograph that had caused all of this. She walked to the center of the room and turned the screen so everyone could see it. Nobody smiled when they looked at it now. Earlier, people had admired the lighting, the decorations, and the way everyone fit together around the tree. Now they noticed something else. The absence. "It looks wrong," one cousin admitted quietly. Another relative nodded. "It does." Megan looked toward me. I did not see it before. Her voice trembled slightly. Or maybe I did not want to. Several people murmured in agreement. What surprised me most was how quickly perspectives changed once people allowed themselves to be honest. The photograph had not changed. The people looking at it had. Walter leaned forward in his chair. "That is the danger of exclusion," he said. "It rarely feels significant to the people doing it." Nobody argued. Daniel finally lifted his head. "Dad is right." The room became silent again. He looked directly at me. "I spent years telling myself small things did not matter." He paused. "I convinced myself that avoiding conflict was the same thing as keeping peace." His voice grew quieter. It was not. For the first time all day, nobody seemed interested in defending him. Not because they were angry, because they understood. Daniel was exposing something bigger than a single decision. He was exposing a pattern, one that had quietly shaped our marriage for years. Walter nodded slowly. "Peace built on someone else's pain is not peace." Those words seemed to settle over everyone in the room. I noticed relatives exchanging thoughtful looks. Some appeared embarrassed. Others looked genuinely sad. Then Walter stood up. At 72 years old, he moved carefully but confidently. He walked toward the Christmas tree and looked at the space where the photograph had been taken earlier. "I think we have spent enough time talking about what happened," he said. "Now we should decide what happens next." Several people looked up. Walter smiled for the first time all afternoon. "Because that photograph is not going to be the one this family remembers." Then he turned toward me and extended his hand. "Claire," he said warmly, "would you help me fix it?" For a moment, nobody moved. Then I placed my hand in Walter's and stood up. A warm smile spread across his face as he led me toward the Christmas tree. The room felt different now. Not because the decorations had changed. Not because the snow outside had stopped falling. Because the truth had finally been acknowledged. One by one, family members stood and followed us into the living room. The same place where the original photograph had been taken. The same place where I had been quietly left behind only a few hours earlier. This time, everything felt different. Walter positioned himself near the center and looked around the room. "Before we do this," he said, "I want everyone to understand something." The room became quiet again. A family is not defined by convenience. It is not defined by tradition alone. It is defined by the people who show up for one another year after year. His eyes settled on me, and Claire has done that more times than I can count. I felt emotion rise in my chest. Around me, several relatives nodded. Megan stepped forward and wrapped an arm around my shoulder. Others moved closer. Nobody seemed worried about appearances anymore. They simply wanted to be honest. Then Walter pointed toward the center of the group. "That is where Claire belongs." For a second, I could not speak. The space directly beneath the Christmas tree had always been occupied by someone else. Yet nobody questioned it. Nobody hesitated. They made room immediately. Daniel walked over slowly and stopped in front of me. His expression was filled with regret. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "Not just for today. For all the times I chose what was easy instead of what was right." The room remained silent. I could see that he meant it. Whether it would repair everything was a question for another day, but it mattered that he finally understood. I nodded once. "Thank you." Walter handed the phone to one of the cousins. Then he took his place beside me. "Ready?" he asked. I smiled. "Yes." Everyone gathered together. Children sat in front. Grandparents stood near the center. Family members adjusted positions and laughed softly. This time, nobody was missing. This time, nobody stood behind the camera wondering where they belonged. The phone clicked, then clicked again. Several more photos followed. Genuine smiles replaced forced ones. When the last picture was taken, people immediately crowded around the screen. A different kind of silence followed. Not uncomfortable, meaningful. The photograph felt complete. Later that evening, as the sun disappeared and Christmas lights reflected against the snow outside, I found myself looking at the final image one more time. Walter stood beside me. "Better?" he asked. I smiled. "Much better." He nodded. "Good." Then he added something I will never forget. "The strongest families are not the ones that never make mistakes. They are the ones willing to admit them." As I looked at the photograph, I realized he was right. The day had begun with exclusion. It had nearly become another quiet memory I carried alone. Instead, it became something else entirely. A reminder that sometimes the most important person in the room is the one willing to speak when everyone else stays silent. And thanks to Walter, the picture that mattered most was not the one where I was left out. It was the one where I finally knew I belonged.